All right, guys, this is chapter 3A. I'm just going to get right into it. It's just talking about energy flows. So kind of looking at what we were talking about in chapter 2 with efficiency of energy, but now we're looking at more of the biological side of it and how the systems are affected by the transfer of energy. So we're going to look at all the little mechanisms and the creatures that help that, right? So let's start big. Let's go. Okay, so we're going to look at ecosystem boundaries, and this idea of ecosystem boundaries is going to matter when we start talking about the source of energy and the recycling of energy. We're going to look at photosynthesis and respiration, and we're going to distinguish among the trophic levels that exist in food chains and food webs, and we're also going to quantify ecosystem productivity. Okay, so this is looking at the amount of energy input versus the energy that is used and transferred throughout the system. All right, ecosystem boundaries are not clearly defined. You got things that move around all over the place. Topography changes over time just depending on what happens. So it's really hard to determine how much energy is going to be able to stay because ecosystems are not, clearly defined boundaries, right? Like you have lots of transitional things that happen. Even though it's helpful to distinguish between two different ecosystems, ecosystems interact with other ecosystems at the boundaries, right? And also because of individuals that might travel in between both of them. So what is this idea of a biosphere? It's the region of our planet where life resides. It's the combination of all ecosystems. All right, so here's a little idea of ecosystem boundaries. So we could be talking about an entire park, and you see that it's not necessarily very clearly defined, right? And because there are populations and individuals that can transfer in and out, the energy can go in and out as well, right? So some things are a little bit more bound than others, but then again, you still have seeds and pollination that can make these things go beyond the boundaries, right? You also have little teeny ecosystem boundaries right here. It's something as simple as the little nodule in a tree, or a little hole in a tree with some water in it. Now all of a sudden you got like a little miniature microcosm of like a lake. You got like a photic zone, you got littoral zone, you got all this stuff going on here. You got bacteria and just lots of things that'll help cycle the energy in and out. Of course, the sunlight comes in, right? But then all that energy gets kind of used in here. So how you define an ecosystem, you can have something with a really well-defined boundary like this, or you can have something like a park, which just only has the boundaries that human beings arbitrarily put on them, right? Okay, but this idea of diversity is important either way as we start getting into disturbance later on in the section. Photosynthesis, you need to know the equation for photosynthesis, or like the general products that go into it, and we talked about that in class the other day. We use energy in the sun to produce usable forms of energy. This is known as an autotroph, so any sort of plant or plankton or something like that that uses sunlight solely for their energy and synthesizes and exhibits some sort of growth as a result of just sunlight energy is going to be an autotroph. And what you need to know in general is that some of the we talked about the products and the reactant side products turn into, rewind that, reactants will form products. All right, you need to know what kind of goes into the reactant and the product side here. Okay, so you need to know what goes into the reactant and product side. So in general, you're going to need some energy over here, usually solar energy. You're going to need oxygen, you're going to need CO2 actually, you're going to need some CO2 for plant growth. And all that stuff combined together is going to end up getting you, really roughly speaking, we're talking about plants. Right, we're going to get some carbohydrates out of there. We're going to get some oxygen as a waste product, right? All right, this takes advantage of the conservation of mass. So just make sure if you're answering a multiple choice question or something like that, you look for things that have the same number of elements on each side. Okay, cellular respiration. Whereas photosynthesis was capturing energy in the plant for cell growth, cellular respiration is the opposite. Okay, you're going to unlock the energy in the chemical compounds, and it's going to get released out of the plant, right? Okay. All right, we get to aerobic respiration. This is talking about being in the presence of oxygen, being in the presence of O2, and being able to create energy, carbon dioxide and water, right? So this is what we're talking about right here. But you have to be in the presence of oxygen for that. Anaerobic, which means without oxygen, is you're going to convert glucose and energy in the absence of oxygen. Photosynthesis and respiration. So here you go. You need to know, generally speaking, here are the things we need for that. So what do you need to add to your little equation there? It's some water, right? You need water, you need CO2, you need energy. And then what's going to happen over here? We create sugar and oxygen. So be able to recognize this on multiple choice exams. I may put that on there, right? So you need to be able to verbalize how this happens. But on an FRQ or something like that, you are totally okay with just writing out this equation if they ask you for the process. Of course, you need to still put it into a complete sentence or something like that. But you can use chemical formulas as parts of your free response. Okay, but just be okay with both, right? Be okay knowing that this is water, that's carbon dioxide, but I mean you can tell just from the nomenclature, that's glucose, that's oxygen, right? Don't forget you need energy. You need to make sure the energy is in your equation. Alrighty. Okay, respiration on the other hand. Here we go. Taking the energy in. Energy comes out, right? So these were the finished products. So if you were to just take this and flip it backwards, guess what you would get? You would get respiration, right? You see that? So whereas glucose and oxygen are the products of photosynthesis, in respiration, they are the things that are expelled outward, right? So you're not assimilating this. Instead, you are letting it out of the system here. Of course, rodents aren't going to be able to perform photosynthesis, right? But just keep that in mind, right? The chemical equation looks almost the same. And just also keep in mind that even though there is a yellow arrow coming out of this rat's butt, it is not expelling solar energy, okay? It is just expelling energy, probably in the form of heat, right? Heat. All right, so what are these things, these consumers? These are going to be things that eat other things. Okay, they can't do photosynthesis like the rat, so it must obtain its energy by consuming other organisms, also known as hetero, meaning other, and troph is eating, right? All right, herbivore, herb is plant, eats producers. So a producer is something that produces energy at the lowest level for everything else, right? So these are going to be like your plants and plankton and stuff like that. Plants, plankton. Plankton, right? Primary consumer. Okay, also known as a primary consumer. Okay, carnivore, something that eats other consumers. So you can kind of see that there's like a little bit of a chain here. Secondary consumers eat the primary consumers. All right, so you think of some things that eat plants, right? And then you think of your secondary consumers, which eats the lower ones, and then tertiary are usually the ones at the top, right? So as we start getting into this, you probably are activating your biology knowledge, and we start remembering the idea of food webs, but something that's very important in apes is this idea of trophic pyramids. It's going to come up in all kinds of FRQs, this idea of trophic pyramids and what happens to the pyramid if you take out something at the bottom. So just start thinking of it as a kind of like a house of cards, or like you're stacking a bunch of things on top of each other. If I mess up just one little thing, let me see if I can zoom in here, just get this out the way. So a house of cards looks, it's a bunch of cards stacked like this, and then of course now you can stack them like this and stack them like this. This is a terrible picture. But if I were to take out something here, this entire thing crumbles, right? So this idea of like a trophic cascade, a cascade effect where like one thing falls so everything else is triggered too, almost like a domino effect, right? So we start looking at the importance, the bigger picture of every individual in their niche. This is the word niche, niche, whatever. This basically just means your job or your role in the ecosystem, the environment. Every single one of these actors within the ecosystem has a particular niche or job. And even though you might not think something as insignificant as a worm or like a dung beetle, you might not think that they're very significant, but it performs a job in that ecosystem, a very, very important job. Ecosystems evolve and develop just like biological organisms do. They don't think or feel or have blood or anything like that, but they go through cycles of survivability based on the conditions, right? So everything in that environment is adapted to that specific climate, that specific humidity, the specific nutrients that are available, the amount of water. All that stuff is specific just to that region. So if you come around and mess up any of these things, even if we're talking about lions on the savannah, you take the lions out of the savannah, we're going to see this with wolves in Yellowstone Park later in the year, that it will create a cascade effect and you'll lose everything. You'll lose everything, and it's kind of weird. How can trees be connected to things like eagles and wolves, right? It's kind of strange, right? But they are, and we'll learn about that later. All right, so here we go. Here's a picture. We have an aquatic biome. You can see why it's hard to define boundaries of an ecosystem, because we're looking at an aquatic environment. That's where it starts. And then we slowly move up to like the primary consumer, secondary consumer. Look at the tertiary consumer. This guy can go all over the place, right? He might not die in the lake. If he doesn't die in the lake, he's not going to decompose there. So that energy goes somewhere else, right? So that's interesting. That's also one of the difficulties of studying systems like that and looking at energy flows on a terrestrial food chain. Sorry, you guys are your producers here, primary consumers, secondary consumers, right? Save Alex the lion, right? Right. So you need to know kind of like how these things work. Now, what is going to be different when we start looking at more of like an ape's perspective, and you probably know this from bio, is these relative numbers are not going to be the same all the way up. So you might see something that kind of shrinks in order to be able to sustain that environment, right? And we'll talk about why as we start looking at total energy and we start looking at gross primary productivity, right? All right, so food webs you should be pretty familiar with. They look at the different trophic levels. What is a scavenger? Not just students that come in and try to pick up points after they fail a test, but they are organisms that consume dead animals, right? All right, detritivore, very important, right? There are things that you probably don't know about. You probably are familiar with scavengers and decomposers, but a detritivore is somebody that takes stuff that a decomposer will eventually break down, but kind of makes it into smaller particles first, right? So if you were going to see, I'm trying to think of a good example of this. Let's say you had like a wood chipper or something like that, and it couldn't take, a gigantic sequoia tree, which you shouldn't be cutting down, but let's say you couldn't fit an entire sequoia tree into the wood chipper. But, okay, never mind, I got a better one. Let's say you're trying to shred a book, right? An entire textbook. You might not be able to put the whole textbook into the shredder, right? Which would be the decomposer in this analogy. But perhaps you can get your little brother or sister, a little detritivore, like a dung beetle, your little brother's a dung beetle, and ask him to rip the pages out, right? So he can rip the pages out, make it into more manageable sizes, and then the decomposer can break it down further, right? Okay, why does this matter? Why does this matter? Well, this energy is pretty much fixed for this system. Now, there are some ways that things like vultures can come in from other mountain areas way in the background over here. We go way in the background, way over there. Okay, so if we go eagles and vultures and stuff from way over there, they might be able to come in and die and leave some energy there, which is great for everybody. But for the most part, like, there is not a whole lot of energy moving in and out, unless there's like, some sort of massive disturbance event here that gets rid of everything. But, so basically the energy that is here is stuck here. So I need stuff that can move energy upward, right? For all these other animals, like these primary consumers, the secondary consumers, right? For the scavengers to be able to eat. But then when they all die, I need to be able to return this back into the soil, right? Because one of the things that you need to make sure, and I've been harping on this a little bit here, is that your soil is more than just like dirt. Your soil is more than just dirt. That soil has your nutrients. It's got nutrients in there, right? And that is the stuff of life for everything, right? So we're going to do an entire unit on like soil and agriculture. I know it doesn't sound too fun, but it is actually one of the more interesting units of the entire year. I think they're all fascinating, but soil for some reason, last year everybody seemed to have that's when their ape's brain really came alive, when we started playing around with soil and studying it, right, in depth. So what returns those nutrients to the soil, right? You got your decomposers and you have your bacteria and stuff like that. There's a lot of bacteria in the soil. That's one of the secret ingredients of soil, is that there is healthy bacteria. We studied a little bit today about Houston, right, and we talked about some of the issues with stormwater, right, stormwater management, right? And what was the thing that really messed up Houston's ability to be able to evacuate safely was the fact that they have such a, I mean, among other reasons, the fact that they're, a lot of places are below sea level and they're flood prone. But one of the big things that I hope you gleaned from that is that the prevalence of hard surfaces, they end up increasing flood. They end up increasing your probability of flood. But what we don't really talk about yet, because we're not quite there, but I do want to introduce it anyways, is anytime you put a hard surface down, where do you put it? It's not just like, there wasn't always concrete there. You're putting it down on soil. And what is soil giving you? It's giving you your nutrients. It's giving you your bacteria, right? So what happens when you start covering and paving up areas that were once natural sponges for rain, right? They're natural drainage zones. You end up losing these services that the bacteria and just the soil itself was providing for the entire ecosystem. You're losing this energy by capping it with pavement, right? Okay, so that's something to keep in mind. Here's your detritivore, right? Your dung-rolling beetle. So maybe this cheetah takes a mondo dump on the ground, and it's too much dump for the bacteria to handle. So what does the dung beetle do? It rolls it up into a nice little dung beetle ball, and it is now more manageable for this bacteria. So now the bacteria can eat crap, and it's more manageable than when it was a gigantic mountain of crap. So that's lovely. All right, gross primary productivity. It's the total amount of solar energy that producers in an ecosystem capture via photosynthesis. Now that's photosynthesis, right? In a given amount of time. And this is measured in, I want to say, don't quote me on this, but I think if I remember, kilograms of carbon per meter, per square meter, per day or year, just depending, right? But so we're looking at the amount of carbon, usually like in CO2, because that's what we measure in the product of respiration, right? And for respiration and also parts of photosynthesis, right? So we look at photosynthesis and cell respiration, it's going to be a movement of carbon and CO2, either synthesizing into the body or being expelled out, depending on the direction, right? Now, we don't capture all this, as you're going to see in the next graphic. I'll show you in a minute. But now the gross in general, whether you're taking econ or you're taking science, the gross is kind of like the total, right? So this is the total. Like, you're not adjusting it for any sort of changes or losses or anything like that. When you think gross, I want you to think big, right? Gross, I think, has an etymology, which means something like big, right? Now, the net is going to be the difference between your total and what you actually lost. So this is like your gross income is the total amount of money without taxes, right? Your net income is what you actually get to take home after all the deductions are taken out, right? So that's the same thing here with net PP, NPP, the energy captured in an ecosystem minus the respiration, so the stuff that you would actually expel in the form of energy and CO2, right? Okay, so here you go. So all the stuff on Earth that we play with is right here. Okay, this is all the stuff that plants can actually capture, this GPP. Okay, 60% of it is lost to respiration. That sucks, right? 40% of it goes into NPP, the stuff that we actually get to use, and this, of course, changes little bits here and there, but generally speaking, it's a 40-60 thing. We get to use very little. What's even more shocking is that the majority, I mean, I told you in the previous chapter, when we were talking a little bit about energy, that almost all energy on Earth is derived in some way from the sun, right? If it weren't for the sun, the plants wouldn't grow, and if the plants didn't grow, then all those things in the food chain wouldn't be able to do what they do, right? But 99% of the solar energy that hits Earth, we don't get to capture at all, right? So this kind of gives you an idea, when we start talking about energy production later on, that we have quite a bit of ways to go before we start tapping out, even our ability to harness energy with solar panels, right? Because 99% of it's reflected back into space, or it passes through producers without being absorbed, right? If they have any sort of translucency or they're not completely opaque, that's what happens, all right? So just keep that in mind. We have a lot of reflection, and this is the thing to look for right here. When we start talking about climate change, when we start talking about GPP, we start talking about heat and stuff like that, and temperature, we're looking at albedo, we're looking at reflection of solar energy. Okay, let's finish this up. Okay, biomass is the total mass of all living matter in a specific area. And obviously, depending on where you're at in the world, if you have, what do you think is going to be the relationship between the amount of sunlight in an ecosystem and the amount of biomass in there, right? All right, so think about that. It's pretty obvious, right? You got more sunlight, you have more potential for producers, right? Autotrophs. Okay. Standing crop is the amount of biomass present in an ecosystem at a particular time. Ecological efficiency, the proportion of consumed energy that can be passed from one trophic level to another. And we're going to do a nice little fun activity lab with this, right? You can play sticky hands. It's going to be fun. Okay, trophic pyramid, a representation of distribution of biomass numbers and the energy among trophic levels. So you're going to see what I was talking about at the beginning of the presentation. Here you go. So you see that that bar at the beginning I told you about is not an even bar all the way through each trophic level, right? It drops off. And what do you notice about this number? 10,000. If I lop off one number, look at that. 1,000 is only a tenth of 10,000, and 100 is only a tenth of 1,000, right? So what's happening to the amount of energy from each step? We're losing about 90%. Only 10% is passed on from level to level. Now, this isn't like necessarily a hard and fast number, but you should know that it's general. Sometimes like you can expect it to be maybe 14%, sometimes 8, right? But it should all kind of be around and hover around this 10% rule, okay? And remember, we're measuring energy, so we're looking at joules and kilojoules, right? Just depending. All right, so that's everything for 3A. I hope that was helpful. I'll do a 3B one pretty soon. Good luck with that and study.